I've always had a keen sense of emotions. I can feel the energy in any place I go. I dread going into places that are crowded because it's so draining. I always have a sense of whether or not someone is happy or sad, but anger seems to be the strongest of these for some reason. Anyways, the experiences started when I was 14. It started innocently enough. Footsteps down the hallway when I was home alone. The bathroom door opening and closing on its own. What's strange is it escalated quickly from there. It makes me wonder if it was due to me becoming a devout Pentecostal at the time. I'm now agnostic, but currently have this yearning or pull, if you will, to search for something more, and I can't explain it. My dad and I went to a Civil War hospital that was under renovation the same year, and we decided to split from the group as our curiosity got the better of us, as it often does. We went past this one room with the door slightly cracked open. We froze in our tracks when this incredible stench filled the air. It smelled like death, but not like an animal. It was unlike anything else in this world. I could tell it was a human decay. I asked my dad if he smelled it, and after that I backed away quickly and almost threw up everywhere. My dad grew pale and said, "This feels evil. We need to go." The rest of the group, along with my mom, caught up with us, and after reluctantly walking by the room again, we asked several different people, including the guide, if they smelled anything strange. No one knew what we were talking about. My dad, he had had experiences since he was young, ranging from visits from his deceased grandmother at the end of his bed and the notorious Hat Man, and numerous others. I sometimes wonder if I got it from him, but who knows. My family and I went to Gettysburg the following summer and walked around Devil's Den. As the sun was setting, my mother and I looked across the battlefield, imagining how it may have looked back then and really taking it all in. Then not too far from us, we saw a man in a Confederate uniform overlooking the battlefield as well. In some strange, nostalgic gaze, my mom asked me if I saw him too, and I told her I did. When we looked back, he had vanished. We wanted to at first think that it was a reenactor, but there's no way in hell he would have walked away that fast without us seeing him again. The area was huge and completely open. In college, I naively taunted a spirit in the dorm building who committed suicide in the communal showers in the early 60s. I just wanted to see something. I was with another morbidly curious friend, and oh boy, did we see something. She stalked our dorm hall in heels late at night, jiggled the door handle furiously, and pounded on the door. After these things would happen, and growing a pair, I would open the door and nothing would be there, to our shock and horror. It flung closet doors open in our dorm, and no one ever wanted to come into the room after hearing about these things. The morning after I taunted this spirit, though, is what scared me the most. I was leaving our dorm to go to class. As I was locking the door, I dropped my keys, and felt as if something forcibly turned my body to the left. I lifted my head and saw her. She stared me down with the most evil look on her face. Her hair was done in a beehive, and what I could only call skin had a grayish-green, slightly glowing tone to it. I snapped out of my gaze and sprinted out of the building and broke down into tears. The last couple instances I've had were the most terrifying, though. I was 19 and back from college for summer break. I recalled that I was dreading my childhood bedroom for some reason. For the months I was back on break, I couldn't shake the feeling. My parents had to get the house cleansed after my mom had enough of the low, maniacal laughing she would hear while alone in the house. I was taking a bubble bath with some candles lit when the music I was listening to started to freak out on me. It would go from unbearably loud to low and back and forth. Then it became super distorted and warped and turned into a high-pitched ringing and faded into static. It wasn't the radio or anything. I was listening to a brand new CD. I freaked the hell out and wrapped up in a towel, and as I opened the door to get out of the room, I saw 3 shadow people across the hall in my childhood bedroom. They were just black, cloaked masses at least 7 feet tall. They didn't move, and I just stared right back at them, frozen in my tracks. I rubbed my eyes to make sure I wasn't seeing anything, but they were still there. I got so freaked out that I found myself yelling, "You're not welcome," and then I managed to scream, "Leave." After a few seconds, they just vanished. I was seriously starting to wonder if something was wrong with me. I was getting scared of myself. I didn't drink, I didn't do drugs, and I've been screened for mental disorders. The icing on the cake is when I sat up abruptly in bed one night. Well, it was more like I was forcibly pulled up to a sit. Once I was pulled up, I saw this ungodly, otherworldly green face with razor-sharp red fangs fly at me. I scrambled out of my room and darted for my parents' bedroom. I closed the door to the room and made sure it was locked. I was having a hard time calming myself down and started hyperventilating. On the floor, with my back pushed up against the door to ensure nothing would break down the door, I heard a low growling, laughing, and scratching at the door. The knob started jiggling, and I started sobbing and pleading in my head for this thing to go away. It did, and then for some odd reason, I walked up to the end of my parents' bed and stood there for what felt like at least 45 minutes. In a daze, I couldn't move. All the while, wishing one of them would just wake up. My mom shot awake in a panic and was obviously distressed seeing me there. She asked if I was okay, but I just played it off as a bad dream. I didn't want her to think I was crazy. After that, I decided to step away from Christianity out of fear, and things slowly stopped happening altogether besides some odd experiences here and there. In 2011, I prayed to God one last time for a sign if I needed to change my life. I just went through a terrible breakup and a very toxic relationship. Not even a week later, I was ejected from my friend's truck after we were T-boned. She had ran a stop sign, but thankfully no one was killed. I can recall waking up on the side of the road and something like a dark figure sprinting past me. I just associated it with my injuries at the time, but it was interesting nonetheless. My parents told me a preacher came over to tell them I would be just fine and that I have a purpose that I need to be fulfilled. Therefore, God wasn't ready to bring me home. After I was able to walk again, my mom and I went to a store, and this man we had never seen before came up and hugged me and stated that God's light is all around you, and then just walked away. It was really weird, but maybe he was just being nice. I question again if these things had anything to do with the Christianity or if something else was at play. I still feel as if I'm being watched at times, but it's very rare, and I get these odd electric tingly feelings in my body, sometimes experiencing abrupt shifts from hot to cold. My mom is Native American and her family was a part of the Pawnee tribe. Maybe this has something to do with that, but I have no idea. My dad is English and Scottish, so who knows? Now, just to start with, I'm a pretty firm believer in the afterlife. I've had a lot of things happen to me that I'm now convinced there is something out there. I just started at this new facility at work in October of last year. I've met a lot of really amazing people there, and I've also lost a lot from that time until now. One of them being an older lady that we'll just call Jill. Jill was a very religious woman who had recently lost her husband. When I first met her, she told me everything about him and how peaceful his body looked at the viewing of his funeral. Doing her rounds, I had caught her sobbing in the early morning from 3 to 5 a.m. in the dark by her bed. I would ask if she was okay, and she would only look up at me in tears and then go back to sobbing. She had once told me that I had a holy aura about me, and she felt at peace when I was in the room. I had never heard that before, so I was pretty intrigued. I spent a lot of time with her discussing the afterlife and what was going to happen to her. We talked about if it would hurt, and if her husband was waiting, things of that nature. It didn't take long for her to decline. Before I knew it, she had passed away. And since then, her room has been completely empty. And this is where it gets weird for me. My first shift with her room being empty was strange. I had just recently got on the clock and locked the doors to sit down and read recent shift reports. Oddly enough, I got a page from her room. 120. Strange. I'm not gonna lie, I was a little panicky, but I got up and headed down the hall. Now, before this, I had gone around and locked all the side doors, one of them being just outside her room, which was now unlocked and standing open. I hurried up and shut the door because I felt as if someone was peering through the door at me, and closing it did make me feel better. Since I was heading down to answer a call from someone in an empty room, I was a little bit shocked to find the door was locked, and I had not locked this one when I shut it earlier. I took out my keys and fumbled around until I got it into the lock, opened the door, and pressed the cancel button on the wall. The room was frigid. I quickly closed the door and walked back to the office. She had called me at 11 p.m. I had noted this in the shift report because we'd been having building problems lately, so I just chalked it up to that. The next day, the same thing happened. Locked door, empty room. Only this time the call came at 12 a.m. Ever since the first day, it's been getting later and later when she calls. 1 a.m., then 2 a.m. I'm not sure what she's trying to tell me, and it's starting to freak me out. I wait until the clock turns, and right when it does, the room calls. Tonight it was at 3 a.m., and I'm starting to become frightened. I have voiced out to her that she is okay and she needs to move on, but she won't go. I am convinced it is her because I can feel her presence, and I have felt her following me around when I do my rounds. This happened to my uncle when he and my mother and their brothers were living together as children. To give you a better understanding of this, they lived in Rio Grande Valley, Texas, and this was back in the late 70s. So kids around this time loved to go outside and play and just be, kids. The house that my uncle and other family members had lived in had many creepy ghost encounter stories, but this particular one was the one that every time I think about it sends chills down my spine. So like I mentioned earlier, he was a little kid and loved to play outside with his brothers and sisters. Well, one day, him and his siblings were debating over what they should play together. After a brief moment of them thinking, everyone decided to play an old-fashioned game of hide-and-seek. Now, my uncle and his siblings have played this game more than once before, and my uncle was known to play this game extraordinarily well, so sometimes they have quite a bit of trouble finding him. Going back, everybody split up and found a spot to hide. Now, I don't exactly remember where he said everyone else hid and who did the seeking, but I do know where my uncle decided to hide. By accident. They had a fairly large backyard and a couple of cactuses and trees. Somewhere back there they had an old refrigerator, which my uncle was nearby. He was all by himself walking through the backyard searching for a spot to hide, until he got a very disturbed feeling that somebody is watching him. So feeling cautious, he decides to turn around and check to see if anybody is indeed looking at him. Now, ever since my uncle told me what he saw, I swear it gives me chills and goosebumps to this day. What he had seen was terrifying. Looking up at the roof of their house, he saw what stood a very skinny, limp figure. Unhumanly possible skinny. Altogether, it looked to be like some kind of living scarecrow creature. and it had small pint eyes just sitting there, staring at him intensely. The strange thing was they don't have any scarecrows around their area, much less their own house, and even if they did, why would someone even want to go through the struggle to hurry and put something like that on the roof? And how could they make it move on its own? While staring at my uncle at this point, he gets terrified at what he's witnessing and hurries to find somewhere to hide. So he hides in the closest object near him, the fridge. He jumps in and shuts the door immediately, hoping that this thing won't do anything to him. After a while of sitting in the fridge, he starts to get bored and attempts to get out, but the door became stuck. It was fairly old. Eventually, one of his siblings, I'm thinking it was my mom, found him in the fridge much later that day, and everyone was thankful, of course, that he was okay after a long while of looking for him. I'm thankful my uncle was okay too, and I'm very happy I got to hear about this encounter he had. He told me he later found out that that childhood home they lived in, the previous residents, were notorious for doing various forms of witchcraft. When I was a small child around 5 years old, my mother and grandmother would buy me porcelain dolls. Despite my consistent protests that I didn't like these dolls and had no interest in them, they would continue to gift me them for birthdays and special occasions. I asked why once, and the only response my mother gave was they'll be worth a lot of money someday. During the summer of one year, when I had turned 8 years old, my mother, one of my older cousins, and I were driving home from picking me up at school and decided to stop by a garage sale down the street from our house. The house wasn't creepy or anything. It was rather modern looking, had a small family living there, but they were moving out. Anyways, my mother and cousin wander off looking at some clothing, leaving me to look at the toys and games since I had just gotten a Game Boy Color and they had games for it. I was itching to get a few. I picked out a few, I think Kirby and a Pokemon game. I can't remember which, but I begged my mom for $8 for them. I hadn't noticed my mom and cousin had bought something beforehand until we got home, and I noticed my cousin carrying a paper bag. Not carrying by the handles though, it looked more like she was cradling it close to her. I asked her what it was and her eyes lit up, almost like she was dying in anticipation to tell me. She quickly pulled out a Anne of the Green Gable doll. She called her Annie and was attached to that doll from the moment she got it. I found this very strange. My cousin's feelings toward dolls has always been the same as mine. We found them disturbing, to say the least. But suddenly she was just obsessed with this doll, stuck to it like glue wherever she went. It was almost a little intimidating at some points. She would become very agitated and irritable when she was away from the Annie doll and would accuse us of hiding her or throwing her away, going so far as to rummage through all of my belongings and even the garbage looking for her. My mom and dad and I always sincerely told her we never moved the doll, but it would appear in the most mundane, strange spots. On top of the fridge, in the cupboards, under the bed, even in the heat vents. I remember one time I found the Annie doll sitting propped up on the edge of my bed facing my door, so it was the first thing I made eye contact with when walking in. I was paralyzed when I saw her sitting there almost taunting me with this blank, emotionless smirk. I shrugged it off as my cousin trying to mess with me. My parents always also claimed to each other they felt uneasy around the doll after a few months of it being under our roof, like it was watching them. And my mom even claimed she saw the doll standing on its own on the couch, but when she looked back, it was lying on its side looking at her. After a while, the doll went missing. Completely. No one was able to find it. I remember my cousin flipping off the handle and accusing everyone in the house that they got rid of it. The most off-putting part is, she always said that Annie always told me you didn't like her. She told me you all hated her and wanted her to leave. I had found her talking to the doll a few times, but I always thought it was just the way I did, using my imagination. But a part of me started to feel like she was having an actual deep conversation with this doll, and I was sorry to find out later that I was right. More years passed, and I was around 16, living in a different part of my country. I hadn't seen this doll in over 5 years and had pretty much forgotten all about its existence at this point, until my mom ended up going to visit my aunt and cousin, who had the doll all along. When she came back, my cousin had apparently passed me on a gift. I was excited, of course, and eagerly opened the box, but my heart sunk seeing the same eyes of the same Annie doll my cousin had. I almost wanted to break the doll right there, throw it away and never look back, but I really couldn't. It was a gift after all. A month or so afterwards, I had made sure to keep this doll in a box under the stairs with the rest of my dolls. I hardly went into the basement anyway, so I never really felt too bothered by it, until it started moving around the house. I'd find her in my room, in my parents' room, the kitchen, the living room, all in really odd spots and angles, always making sure to face the way you were walking in. It was really intimidating, and you were always feeling a little on edge because you never knew when or where she would turn up. A few times when I was alone, I could swear I heard my name being called, softly, almost in a whisper, but I ignored it, always reminding myself I was alone and had no need to be so curious. The worst memory I have is the last month I had ever seen her again. My dad and I took a trip to visit one of my long-distance friends who I hadn't seen for a while, and escape that trapped feeling I had become so used to feeling. And when we came back, we were informed that while we were gone, our house was involved in a robbery and arson. We could go in and look around, but we weren't allowed to stay. My dad didn't want to. He was very torn about it. It was the first time I ever seen him cry. But I went in since most of the place was stable. It was mostly heavy smoke damage. I don't know why, but the first place I seemed to rush to was under the stairs, and saw the box burnt. The fire started there, and everything there was ashes, which kind of relieved me in a weird way. But I should have waited a little longer to feel that way. I looked through the place fully, and as I stepped into the living room, I seen Annie, laying in the middle of the floor in perfect condition, not even touched or fazed by the ash or smoke or fire. I walked to her and picked her up, hesitantly, only to find the patch of carpet under her was black and covered in ash and soot, meaning she was placed there after the fire. But the police told us the place was being watched by them, and after the fire for 2 days, no one came in or out of the house until we got there. I think at this point, I had hit my limit with this doll. I remember my eyes swelling into tears, having this awful feeling of anger and fear take over. I screamed at it, "Why? Why won't you just leave me alone?" I, of course, didn't get an answer, and to be honest, I wouldn't have wanted one. I threw the doll as hard as I could, with all the anger and hatred that had built up, and I watched it shatter against the fireplace mantel. I felt nothing. No release, no good feelings afterwards. I thought I'd be to the point of jumping up and down in joy despite the fact of everything else. But here I was, just standing there emotionless and numb. I almost regretted doing it, but after thinking of all the times that doll would just move around and stare at me with this genuinely ominous expression, disappear for weeks or months on end only to return as if nothing happened. Well, years went by, and my life had gotten a lot better to some degree. I moved again. This time it was because I was in a relationship and we moved in together. I was 23 currently. I'd been happy and hadn't thought about Annie for years, but sadly that changed the other night. I was up a little later than usual after a long graveyard shift at work. I got out late around 2 a.m. and when I got home I couldn't get myself to feel tired with my usual routine, just being a calming tea and some fruits before bed. Usually I'd be right to sleep, but this night was very off. I couldn't seem to shake the feeling someone else was there. It was a familiar feeling, the same feeling I had as a child and a teen. The feeling of Annie. Now, I can't prove what I saw or heard, but I remember sitting up and shifting out of bed to watch some TV to distract myself, and once I turned on the lamp, I could have swore for one moment I heard a child scoff or groan softly, and we don't have a child. The light flickered on, and I swear to God I saw Annie for a brief moment sitting on the couch staring at me. With that stare, it felt slightly different now. More piercing and intimidating, as if she was trying to let me know she was not happy about what I did to her. As quickly as I thought I saw her, after blinking she was gone, and I was standing there alone and shaken, and more on edge than I've ever been. Hey everybody, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this video, and be sure to leave a like, it helps a lot. The better these videos do, the more of them I can make. I got a lot of other great videos on the channel, so check one of those out, or subscribe if you haven't, and stay tuned for more creepy content.